In 1954, a government was erased from the map. No war, no invasion, no army crossing any border, just a phone call, and a fruit company got what it wanted. What followed was 40 years of blood, 200,000 dead, and not a single executive went to prison. Because the weapon was not a gun, it was a banana. But the story of the United Fruit Company and of the banana itself does not begin in Guatemala. It does not begin in a boardroom. It begins in the jungles of Southeast Asia, thousands of years before any European ever tasted a banana. And the journey from that jungle to the boardroom that overthrew a government is one of the most extraordinary stories of corporate power, political corruption, and human cost ever told. The banana is one of the oldest cultivated plants on Earth. Wild bananas, the ancestors of the fruit we eat today, grew in the tropical forests of what is now Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, and Malaysia, at least 10,000 years ago. These wild bananas were nothing like the uniform yellow fruit in your kitchen. They were small, angular, filled with hard seeds, and in many varieties, barely edible. But the people of the region had been cultivating and selectively breeding them for millennia. The first domestication of bananas likely occurred in Papua New Guinea around 8000 BC, making the banana one of the first plants ever deliberately cultivated by human beings. This is earlier than wheat, earlier than rice, earlier than corn. The banana was among the very first things a human being ever decided to grow. Over thousands of years, farmers in Southeast Asia selected and replanted the specimens with the least seeds, the most flesh, and the best flavor. Through this patient process, entirely unconscious of what we would now call genetics, they created the banana we recognize today, a seedless fruit that can only reproduce through human intervention. Every banana plant is a clone. It produces fruit that contains no viable seeds, which means it cannot reproduce sexually. To grow more banana plants, you must take a cutting from an existing plant, a sucker that grows from the base of the parent, and replant it. This means that every banana of a given variety is genetically identical to every other banana of that variety. The same genetic uniformity that made pepper vulnerable to monopoly, the same genetic uniformity that made Irish potatoes vulnerable to blight. The banana carries this vulnerability built into its very nature, and it would eventually be exploited with catastrophic consequences. But first, the banana had to cross the world. By 6000 BC, banana cultivation had spread across Southeast Asia and into the Indian subcontinent. Indian traders carried bananas westward along ancient maritime routes. By 600 BC, banana cultivation was established on the East African coast. Arab traders crossing the Indian Ocean brought bananas to the Arabian Peninsula and eventually to Egypt and the Mediterranean. Alexander the Great reportedly encountered bananas in India in 327 BC and was so impressed that he described them in his journals. Portuguese sailors navigating the African coast in the 15th and 16th centuries encountered banana cultivation in West Africa and recognized its potential as a provision crop for long ocean voyages. It was the Portuguese who carried banana plants across the Atlantic to the Americas, first to Brazil in the 1510s and then northward through the Caribbean. By the mid-1500s, banana cultivation had been established in the Caribbean islands and along the coasts of Central America. The plant had crossed half the world in the hands of traders, sailors, and farmers over 10,000 years. But for most of that journey, it was a local food, a subsistence crop, something people grew and ate where they lived. The idea of the banana as a global commodity, something grown in one place and eaten in another, thousands of miles away, did not exist until a single invention made it possible. refrigeration, and a man from Massachusetts who saw an opportunity. In 1870, a sea captain named Lorenzo Dow Baker made a decision that would change the political map of Central America. Baker was in Jamaica when he bought 160 bunches of bananas for a shilling each. He put them in the hold of his ship, the Telegraph, and sailed north to Jersey City, New Jersey. 11 days later, he sold those bananas for $2 a bunch. The profit was extraordinary, and Baker understood immediately that this was not a coincidence of circumstance. It was a business model. The banana was cheap to produce in the tropics. It transported reasonably well over short ocean voyages. And in the northern cities of the United States, it was an exotic luxury that people would pay significant premiums for. Baker began making regular runs between Jamaica and Boston, building a trading network. He partnered with a Boston produce dealer named Andrew Preston. And in 1885, Baker and Preston joined with a group of investors to form the Boston Fruit Company. The Boston Fruit Company was well organized and profitable, but it was not yet powerful. That changed when it encountered a man named Minor Keith. Minor Keith was the nephew of an American railroad entrepreneur who had obtained a contract from the government of Costa Rica to build a railroad connecting the interior of the country to the Caribbean coast. The railroad was intended to allow Costa Rica to export its coffee crop. The construction was a catastrophe. Over 4,000 workers died during the building, from tropical disease, accidents, and brutal working conditions. Minor Keith's 3 brothers all died during the construction. Keith himself nearly died multiple times, but he completed the railroad, and to do it, he had used his own money, borrowed heavily, and received from the Costa Rican government a remarkable payment in return. Along the railroad right-of-way, the Costa Rican government had given Keith a 99-year lease on 800,000 acres of land. Keith planted bananas on that land to generate income while the railroad was being built. The bananas used the railroad to reach the coast. The railroad used the banana revenue to stay solvent. It was a perfect closed loop, and Keith realized that the banana was not just a revenue source for his railroad. The banana was a global business opportunity of a scale that nobody had yet fully imagined. In 1899, Minor Keith merged his banana operations with the Boston Fruit Company. The new company was called the United Fruit Company, and it would become the most powerful corporation in the history of the Western Hemisphere. The United Fruit Company began acquiring land with an aggression that was extraordinary, even by the standards of the Gilded Age. They operated in Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Cuba, Jamaica, and the Dominican Republic. In each country, they negotiated agreements with local governments that gave them land, tax exemptions, and special privileges that no other company and no individual citizen could obtain. The company built its own railroads, its own telegraph systems, its own ports, its own hospitals, its own commissary stores where workers were required to shop, its own police force. In some countries, the United Fruit Company controlled more infrastructure than the government itself. By the early 20th century, the company owned 3 million acres of land across Central America and the Caribbean. A significant portion of that land was kept deliberately unplanted, held in reserve, so that when disease struck one plantation, the company could simply move to virgin territory. This land banking strategy required enormous acreage, and in countries where land was the primary form of wealth, the United Fruit Company's ownership of millions of acres of the best agricultural land created a permanent underclass of landless workers who had no choice but to labor on company plantations for whatever wages the company decided to pay. The workers on United Fruit Company plantations lived in company housing. They were paid in company scrip, a form of currency that could only be spent at company stores. They received medical care from company doctors at company hospitals, where the cost was deducted from their wages. They worked under contracts that gave them no rights and no recourse. If they went on strike, company security forces, sometimes supplemented by national armies that the company had paid and equipped, broke the strike. If they organized unions, union leaders were imprisoned or killed. If they protested to their governments, the United Fruit Company's representatives met privately with those same governments to ensure the protest was suppressed. The company was not simply a business operating in Central America. It was a parallel government. In Honduras, the United Fruit Company and its competitors, primarily the Cayamo Fruit Company and the Standard Fruit Company, owned so much of the economy that they effectively dictated government policy. When a Honduran president attempted to impose a modest tax on banana exports in the 1920s, the fruit companies responded by supporting a coup against him. This was not unusual. It was the established playbook. And the phrase that was coined to describe the nations where the fruit companies operated captures exactly what they were. Banana republics, countries whose governments existed not to serve their citizens, but to serve the commercial interests of foreign corporations. Countries where elections were held, but outcomes were determined by whoever the fruit company supported. Countries where the law applied to the poor, but not to the company. Countries where the army protected not the population, but the plantation. On December 6, 1928, workers on United Fruit Company banana plantations in the Magdalena region of Colombia went on strike. Their demands were modest. They wanted written contracts. They wanted payment in cash rather than company scrip. They wanted one rest day per week. They wanted adequate medical facilities. These demands were so basic that in any country with functioning labor law, they would have been guaranteed by default. But Colombia in 1928 was a country where the United Fruit Company wielded more power than the labor code. The company refused all demands. The workers refused to return to work. The strike lasted for weeks. 30,000 workers participated at its peak. The United Fruit Company sent a message to the Colombian government. The message was simple: resolve this, or we will leave. And if we leave, we will take our railroad, our ports, our telegraph, our investment, and your economy with us. The Colombian government sent the army. On the night of December 5th and into the early morning of December 6th, Colombian soldiers surrounded the main square in the town of Ciénaga, where thousands of striking workers and their families had gathered. They were told that a government official was coming to hear their grievances. They waited. No official came. What came instead was an order. At midnight, some accounts say just after, a military commander read a declaration that the assembled crowd was an illegal gathering and ordered them to disperse within 5 minutes. In a crowd of thousands packed into a square, 5 minutes was not enough time to disperse even if everyone wanted to. The workers did not have 5 minutes. Almost immediately, the soldiers opened fire. The killing lasted for several minutes. The official Colombian government figure for the dead was 47 people. Survivors and witnesses gave numbers ranging from hundreds to thousands. The actual death toll has never been established. After the massacre, the Colombian army pursued fleeing workers and their families into the surrounding countryside. Bodies were loaded onto trains. The United Fruit Company telegrammed to Washington reported that order had been restored. In Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel, 100 Years of Solitude, the massacre is depicted in devastating detail. Garcia Marquez, who grew up in the region where it happened and heard the stories from survivors, described a square full of bodies and a train carrying the dead to be dumped in the sea. The Colombian government for decades denied that the massacre had taken place at all. They said the official figure of 47 was correct. They said the workers had provoked the violence. They said the United Fruit Company had acted within its rights. The United Fruit Company said nothing. It continued operating. It continued paying dividends to its shareholders in Boston. And the banana kept coming. By 1950, the United Fruit Company was the largest employer in Central America. It was the largest landowner in Guatemala. It owned Guatemala's only railroad. It controlled Guatemala's only Caribbean port. It operated Guatemala's telegraph system. Guatemala functionally belonged to the United Fruit Company in ways that went well beyond what any land title could convey. In 1950, a former military officer named Jacobo Arbenz won the Guatemalan presidential election with 65% of the vote. Arbenz was a moderate reformist. He was not a communist, despite what he would later be called. He was a Democrat who believed that the extreme concentration of land ownership in Guatemala, most of the arable land owned by a tiny elite and a single foreign corporation, was the primary cause of his country's poverty. He intended to change it. In 1952, Arbenz passed Decree 900, the Agrarian Reform Law. It required all uncultivated land on large estates to be redistributed to landless farmers. Landowners would be compensated at the value they had themselves declared for tax purposes. The United Fruit Company had declared a value of its Guatemalan land at $627,172. The Guatemalan government offered to pay that amount. The United Fruit Company responded by claiming the land was worth $15,850 for $849. The difference between these two numbers is the story of what the United Fruit Company had been doing to the Guatemalan tax authority for decades. They had been lying, declaring their land as near worthless to minimize their taxes. And now that the land was being acquired at the price they themselves had declared, they suddenly discovered its true value. The Guatemalan government refused to pay the inflated price. The United Fruit Company went to Washington. The company had extraordinary connections in the United States government. Its public relations firm was run by Edward Bernays, the father of modern public relations, the man who had invented the concept of manufactured public opinion. Bernays ran a campaign to convince American journalists and politicians that Arbenz's Guatemala was a communist beachhead in the Americas, a Soviet puppet state positioned to spread communism throughout the Western Hemisphere. This was not true, but it was effective. The Secretary of State at the time was John Foster Dulles. His brother, Allen Dulles, was the director of the CIA. Both men had previous professional relationships with the United Fruit Company. John Foster Dulles's law firm had represented the company. Allen Dulles had served on the company's board. In 1954, the CIA launched Operation PB Success. A small force of mercenaries trained and equipped by the CIA crossed the border from Honduras into Guatemala. Simultaneously, CIA-operated aircraft bombed Guatemala City and broadcast fake radio transmissions claiming that a large rebel army was advancing on the capital. The reality was a few hundred mercenaries with basic weapons. The fiction was an unstoppable revolutionary force. Arbenz, uncertain whether the Guatemalan army would defend him, chose to resign rather than risk a civil war. He went into exile. He would spend the rest of his life in Cuba, then Mexico, then Uruguay, then Chile, then Mexico again, unable to return to the country he had led because the corporation that had overthrown him was still there. The CIA installed a military government in Guatemala. The land reform was reversed. The United Fruit Company kept its land. The Guatemalan people entered 40 years of military dictatorship, state terror, and civil war. By the time the conflict finally ended in 1996, over 200,000 people were dead. The United Nations Truth Commission attributed the majority of the killings to the Guatemalan military and associated paramilitary groups. The chain of causation that connected those deaths to the United Fruit Company's decision in 1954 is long and complicated, but it is a chain. And it begins with a banana. While the United Fruit Company was reshaping the political map of Central America, the people who actually grew the bananas lived in conditions that the company's shareholders never saw and preferred not to think about. Plantation workers lived in company housing, long barrack-style buildings with minimal privacy and no amenities. They worked 6 days a week, from before dawn to after dark, in tropical heat and humidity that made the work physically brutal. They were paid wages that were designed to ensure they could survive, but could not accumulate any savings or independence. They were required to buy food, clothing, and supplies from company stores at prices set by the company. If a worker became ill, the cost of treatment at the company hospital was deducted from future wages. If a worker was injured on the job, the company determined the compensation. If a worker died, the company decided what, if anything, his family received. The company's judicial relationship with its workers was administered through the company's own rules, enforced by the company's own security personnel. National labor laws, where they existed, did not apply inside the plantation. The plantation was a separate jurisdiction. Workers who attempted to organize faced imprisonment and violence. In Honduras, Guatemala, Colombia, and Costa Rica, union organizers were imprisoned, exiled, or killed. The company did not always pull the trigger directly. They did something more efficient. They communicated their preferences to the governments they controlled, and those governments understood what was expected of them. This system, the plantation as a total institution, combining workplace, residence, commerce, medical care, and judicial power under a single corporate authority, was not slavery in the legal sense, but it shared with slavery the essential characteristic that the people within it had no meaningful freedom and no effective recourse. They could not easily leave. They could not accumulate enough money to start over. They could not organize without risking death. They could not appeal to governments that answered to the company rather than to them. The banana that arrived in American and European grocery stores, bright yellow and uniform and cheap, was the product of this system. The cheerfulness of the fruit was entirely at odds with the conditions of its production. Here is something almost nobody knows about the banana you eat today. It is not the same banana that your grandparents ate. The banana that dominated the global market from the 1870s through the 1950s was a variety called the Gros Michel. People who remember it say it was superior to anything available today. Richer in flavor, creamier in texture, more aromatic, sturdier, easier to ship. The Gros Michel was the banana that built the United Fruit Company's empire, and in the 1950s, it was destroyed. A fungal disease called Fusarium oxysporum cubense, Panama disease, swept through banana plantations across Central America. Because the Gros Michel was a monoculture, every plant genetically identical, the fungus could spread through an entire plantation without encountering any resistance. Once it entered the soil, nothing could stop it. The United Fruit Company abandoned plantation after plantation as Panama disease spread. They cleared new jungle, planted new Gros Michel, and watched those plantations die too. By the late 1950s, the Gros Michel was commercially extinct, the banana that had built an empire. that had driven coups and massacres and the political subjugation of 7 nations, was gone. The United Fruit Company replaced it with the Cavendish, the banana you eat today. The Cavendish was disease-resistant to Panama disease, but it was inferior in almost every other way. Less flavorful, less sturdy, more prone to bruising, harder to ship. And it was still a monoculture. Every Cavendish banana in the world is genetically identical to every other Cavendish banana. Today, a new strain of Panama disease, called Tropical Race 4, is spreading through Cavendish plantations across Asia, Africa, Australia, and increasingly Central America. It is, in the most direct sense, history repeating itself. The same vulnerability, the same disease mechanism, the same inability to fight back genetically. The banana that replaced the banana that was destroyed by disease is being destroyed by disease. Scientists are working on disease-resistant varieties, but the commercial banana industry, having learned nothing from the last collapse, remains a monoculture. The same choices, the same risks, waiting for the same outcome. The United Fruit Company no longer exists under that name. In 1970, after decades of antitrust actions, political scandals, and declining market share, the company rebranded itself as Chiquita Brands International. The name change did not immediately change the practices. In 2007, Chiquita Brands pleaded guilty to making payments to the AUC, a Colombian paramilitary organization designated as a terrorist group by the United States government. The payments totaled $1.7 million over several years. Chiquita admitted that they had paid a terrorist organization for protection of their banana operations in Colombia. They paid a fine of $25 million. No executives went to prison. The company continued operating. The connection between the banana industry and political violence in Colombia, which began with the 1928 massacre, had survived through the 20th century and into the 21st. The countries that were called banana republics in the early 20th century are still among the poorest in the Western Hemisphere today. Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, the nations most thoroughly subjugated by the fruit companies, have some of the highest rates of violence, poverty, and political instability in the Americas. The 40 years of civil conflict in Guatemala that followed the 1954 coup left an economic and social wound that has not healed 70 years later. The banana workers who labor on Central American plantations today earn wages that, adjusted for inflation, are not dramatically higher than what their grandparents earned under the United Fruit Company. The land that was concentrated in corporate hands in the early 20th century has never been fully redistributed. The political systems that were shaped by corporate intervention have never fully recovered their democratic integrity. The banana in your kitchen cost less than $1. Someone in Central America grew it. Someone in Central America lost their democracy so it could be grown. And the company that did that is still in business. It just changed its name. Not bad for a seedless clone from the jungles of Southeast Asia, a fruit that cannot reproduce without human help, that has no viable seeds, that exists only because 10,000 years of farmers decided it was worth keeping. That crossed the world in the hands of traders and sailors. That fed armies and sustained civilizations. That arrived in the Americas in the holds of Portuguese ships. And that was then discovered by a man from Massachusetts who realized it could make him rich. The Forbidden Empire was not built with weapons. It was built with contracts and tax exemptions and political donations, and government officials who understood what was expected of them, and CIA operations that overthrew democracies, and armies that fired on striking workers, and a public relations machine that turned every atrocity into a communist threat. And bananas. Always bananas. Cheap, yellow, uniform, and cheerful. The most innocent-looking fruit in the world, with a history that is anything but. If this story changed how you see the world, subscribe to Dark Crop. Because every week, we pull back the curtain on the foods and commodities that built civilization. The ones with blood on their labels, the ones that overthrew governments, the ones hiding in plain sight, in every kitchen, in every grocery store, in every hand.